this literally is Satan's work from all along. If I want to undermine God, I have to undermine his goodness. I have to undermine his word. I have to question everything that he's decided for me and about me as the creator. I have to undermine that. And so when we see that, it is the biggest thing is decisions that are made for us question our self-determination and our agency. And as human beings, we don't like that.
Welcome to Calvary Conversations. I'm Shaun LePage, the Ministry Studies Chair here at Calvary and Assistant Professor of Ministry Studies. And thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to introduce you to Pamela Cubas today. She's a new addition to Calvary University, and I think you are going to enjoy this conversation that we're going to have. In fact, I think I'm going to have two conversations with Pamela, and we're going to do the first part today, and then share the second part next month. But Pamela is an adjunct faculty member at Calvary. She's brand new to our biblical counseling program. And she also teaches through Lancaster Bible College and Boyce College. She has over 12 years of counseling experience and a Master of Arts in Marriage and Family Therapy. She has counseled in inpatient and outpatient therapy settings for children and teens with issues such as sexual abuse, suicidal ideation, conduct disorders, depression, anger, all kinds of things. And she currently provides pro bono biblical counseling in her local church. And she speaks to youth pastors and C and MA districts on counseling techniques and how to counsel youth going through issues such as grief, depression, loneliness, and gender identity confusion, which is really the main thrust of our conversation today. But she's currently working on a PhD in biblical counseling with a minor in ethics from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Her dissertation focus is on the biblical perspective of attachments. And so I think I'm going to ask you to tell us what that means exactly. But she currently resides in Colorado Springs, Colorado at the Air Force Academy with her active duty Air Force husband, Steve, and 3 teenage children, Tori, Nick, and Maddie. And so that's kind of a long introduction, but Pamela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, as I said, I want to focus our conversation on really, I want to have two big conversations. So Pamela and I want to discuss today a couple of things related to gender identity and sexual identity, and just this cluster of issues related to those subjects. So I want to start by just having Pamela give us her perspective. She's kind of an expert on this. This is kind of the focus of her study and her training. And so I want to get her perspective on just how did we get here? Like how did we come to this place as a culture where we have, so many men identifying as women and women identifying as men, and that we have, for a lot of people, it's going to feel like it's all of a sudden we have multiple genders being discussed and gender reassignment surgery and all these issues. How have we come to this place where these things constitute the norm really for our culture now? And also, a second big conversation is really, and this is where I want it to lead, is how can we have productive conversations with family members and friends and neighbors who are either struggling themselves with these issues, or they have people that they love who are struggling with it, and they're either not wanting to be judgmental, but they want to have conversations with their own family and friends. And so, Pamela, that's where I want to go today. But let's start with you, and really, I guess, just to be kind of blunt and clear about it, is why should people listen to you and what you have to say about these complex and important issues?
Well, that's a loaded question. I'm not sure that they should necessarily listen to me as much as they should listen to God's word.
Right.
That's primary because of the fact that our culture is making this very normal. And so you're going to be presented with so many books and so many opinions that are counter biblical. And I think so you have to first really just listen to God's word. I do a lot of reading on this. I don't know. In the beginning, I wasn't quite sure why this was something that became such an issue that was in my field that I was kind of being forced into by the hand of God. And I mean that with all love and respect. But I all of a sudden had so many opportunities. To start out, my minor with ethics is really what got me in this direction primarily. I took a class on sexual ethics specifically, and it really led to me reading tons of books in this area and just being drawn to it. There is a personal element to it. So when I was younger, I grew up in Missouri, actually. So I live in Colorado Springs now, but I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. And in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for girls to play all of the sports. And I was super athletic. From 5 years old, anything that was a ball, I was doing it. And so especially in soccer, and I think I remember even in basketball, there weren't a lot of girls teams. And so I quickly just joined a lot of the boys teams, but it was much easier. I found it much easier early on to be one of the boys rather than have to prove myself to them. And so I look back at that and I remember specifically the issues that I had with trying to fit in with as athletic as I was, but then having to play on these boys' teams. It just seemed easier to be one of them, but I knew that I wasn't one of them. And I can remember being very angry that I was a girl rather than a boy.
Hmm.
And looking back now, it was very strong. I remember that it was a very strong feeling, and I want to be very specific about that. It led to thoughts like, I hate this. It'd be so much easier if I was a boy. I don't want to be a girl. Why did you make me? My parents are very strong believers. My dad, he's 82 and he's just now retiring as a pastor. So I knew the truth. I knew that God made me and he made me a girl, but I hated it. And looking back, I had to really think through that. And for me, I think the majority of what I was going through was a cultural push, culturally influenced because of the fact that it just was easier for me. I also was, drawn to things that were more boyish. I never liked playing with dolls. I never liked wearing dresses. It just didn't, I saw my brothers and I just wanted to be like them. And I liked what they did rather than what my sisters did. I have two of each. So I saw both and I was just naturally drawn to those things. So I think culturally it wasn't acceptable back then. And so I'm so glad it was not a cultural thing where, because I felt that way and because I did those things, I dressed like a boy, I had short hair, I did everything like that. But the culture wasn't telling me I was a boy. And my parents were very patient, seeing that the way that I was made and the things I was drawn to was part of how God made me. Not that he made me a boy, but that he made me to enjoy these things like sports. And I used to play, cowboys and Indians and ride my bike all the time. And I did those things naturally. And I'm going to be very specific. It was natural for me to love those things. But it took me a while to realize that although I love those things, it didn't make me someone other than who I was created to be. And it actually wasn't until high school that I just was done with all that. I remember I had a really good friend, and he asked me, he said, I don't know who to ask to homecoming, and I'm so bummed I don't have anyone. And I said, well, what about me? Because I thought he was cute. And he said, but you're one of us. And yeah, and when that hit me, I was like, oh my goodness. Because although at that point, I don't think I look back and I don't remember wishing I was a boy still at that point, but I didn't mind the way I dressed. I didn't mind those things, but I just was, I had better conversations with boys, and I didn't like drama. So I was just naturally drawn to that, but that changed everything for me. And it was at that point I just said, oh yeah, I'm done. Like, I need to grow my hair out. I need to dress more girly. Um, because I didn't want that to be what people thought of me. I say all that because this is going to come back around when we talk about the cultural influence and how impactful that is. That was impactful for me, but in a very different way. And then how do we lovingly walk alongside people who are going through this? Now, I would probably say if someone had to talk to me in the 1980s about what I was going through and it was a counselor, they probably would have said, yeah, she has gender dysphoria, right? Because I met all of those things. It was very disruptive for me. I remember specifically walking into a restroom one time with my mom, and the lady said, you need to have your son going into another restroom. And she was like, this is my daughter. And her saying, well, then she should look like a girl. Like, I remember specific things like that. And at the time, didn't bother me so much. Man, bless my mom's heart, what she had to go through while I was going through this. But she was just so loving and patient, not with me as much as she was with the Lord. She knew that the Lord had a plan for me, and she knew that the Lord would work it out. So that's kind of my background with my personal experience with that. And so now I see, kind of in retrospect, God using all of that and my schooling now. And I am very drawn to what kids are going through, and this extreme cultural influence that is not actually helping them to become who God created them to be, but literally could be changing the course of their life forever in a very negative, impactful way.
Well, Pamela, I really appreciate you sharing your own personal story there, because it's probably pretty common, isn't it? I mean, don't a lot of young people, especially, when you're going through puberty and you become more aware of sex and all the related stuff, that isn't it common for there to be confusion and all kinds of mixed feelings and just a lot going on that's hard to sort through, and so there are a lot of girls who are go through a similar experience as you did, trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a girl? Is it strictly the way you look and the activities that you enjoy, or whatever? I mean, don't you think it's pretty common for a lot of girls to go through similar experiences like what you did?
Well, yeah, it's very common. And even if you go into the mental health field, they would agree it's extremely common. I would probably say that, so the younger children, they're not actually wondering what it's like, how should I be as a girl or how should I be as a boy? They're just in a very natural part of life, discovering life,
Right.
discovering, what do I like to play with? What do I like uh, to look at? Do I like this color over this color? I mean, as society, we have created what we call gender normatives. We do it in Christian culture. We do it in secular culture. We do that. And I think that has created some of the push in some ways to be a certain way as a gender. We have to start to recognize that there are going to be boys that God has created to be extremely creative. They love to cook. They love to create things. They love to be in theater and arts, God's going to use that. Whether or not he uses it in the future for something dynamic or big, as we would say, like a career, or he's just using it to grow this individual's character to become more like him and to reach other people for Christ. We don't know what that reason is, but we do know that Psalm 139 says that he specifically and intricately created each person in the womb, right? He has a plan for everyone. And so I think we have to be careful with gender normatives that say, if you're a boy, and especially when we tagline it with Christian boy or Christian man, you have to look like this. You've got to fix cars, and you've got to change the oil, and you've got to do all these things, where those things might be necessary to survive in life. We might need to know how to change a tire, right? But so does a girl, right? We need to be able
Right.
to do these things. But when we tagline it with, if you aren't doing these types of things and you aren't liking football, for instance, or you're not liking sports, you're not being a strong Christian man or strong Christian. We have to be very careful about that, because I think that is what makes it very easy for teens especially to question their gender or question their identity. And so we have to make sure we're not being a part of that. We need to be able to say, wow, God's created you to be really theatrical and really creative. How do you think God's going to use that in your life? That's amazing that you're so talented. That we have to be careful that we don't push them in one direction or the other, because by pushing them in one way, we don't realize that actually there is a natural, rebellious, sinful nature that we have. I think back, and if my parents had pushed me to be a very gender normative girl, I could have easily been like, I'm not doing this. Like, I am not going to do this. And they didn't. And I'm so thankful for that. So we just have to be really careful about these normatives that we've created.
I think that's that's probably at least part of the silver lining of this whole big cultural, explosion of ideas and conversations about these subjects, is that we are, as Christians, are being really forced to re-examine those gender normatives, and really think biblically about those issues, and just recognizing that, like you say, God has created us each differently, and we should be able to celebrate that biblically. I'm not talking about, the idea that God makes people gay, that people are born gay or whatever. I'm talking about those gender normatives. What does it look like to be a man? What does it look like to be a woman? And so I think that's, the silver lining here, that we're being forced to think more biblically about those things, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so let's talk a little bit about counseling. So you're a biblical counselor, and you have people coming to you who have, is the correct term gender dysphoria? Is that still an acceptable term, or is that being questioned as well?
No, that is actually, it used to be gender identity disorder. And then they changed that because they want to take out the word disorder, right?
Right. Right.
So in the new diagnostic manual, it's gender dysphoria. Um, yeah, and that would be the correct term.
Okay.
I can't remember if there was a question there with that.
No, that was actually an additional question. I want to make sure that, I'm using the right terminology, because it seems like it changes pretty regularly. So it's not a disorder as it was in what like the 60s, 70s. It was homosexuality was considered a disorder, right? And then there
Yes, and
was
then they took that out.
right, there was a big change there, and that's a whole historical thing that we don't need to get into. But so gender dysphoria is still the correct term. So you have people who come to you with gender dysphoria, which, I understand that is basically they're just confused. They're maybe having same-sex attraction, or they're just confused about whether they're male or female, or right. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could be encompassed under the umbrella of gender dysphoria, right?
Yeah, for the most part, it's not a sexual thing. For the most part, gender dysphoria is an issue of gender. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have same-sex attraction at all, especially the younger the kids are. We have to remember that for the most part, unless they've dealt with sexual abuse or they've already encountered pornography, the idea of being sexually attracted to anyone is not part of the mix.
Hmm.
I think it is important for us to note a little bit of what is occurring, if we can do that, and why that is occurring.
Right.
Would that be okay?
Yes, certainly.
For us to go that, just because I think having a solid foundation of why this is even so prevalent and accepted now, because we know that there's nothing new under the sun. We even saw in the Old Testament there was a strict law about cross-dressing, right? And so we see that kind of the idea of transsexual, as they would say, or transdressing, or and now we have transgender. We see those things. We see that the issues of, not a man not sleeping with a man, woman not sleeping with a woman, and we see those even all the way back in the Old Testament. There's nothing new under the sun. So I think one of the things we do have to talk about is, why is it that it's so accepted now, whereas in the Old Testament it still wasn't really accepted. We know that homosexuality was part of temple worship. There were things that went on with that, but it really wasn't an accepted form of living. And so I think we have to kind of face that reality. And one of the books that I'm going through right now is Understanding Transgender Identities, and it talks about 5 or 4 views. There's a couple quotes in here, and I think one of the things we have to talk about is not just why is it so accepted, or whether it's gender, whether it's sexual preference, or what it is. We have to get down to what is the real issue. And you'll hear me say this several times today when we talk about how do we address it. We have to keep the main thing the main thing. And so we have to answer, what is the main thing? And we have to look at that and say, okay, what is culture doing? Because this isn't a passive issue that's just all of a sudden happening. Culture is a part of influencing this in a huge way. And I think we have to go back to, so when you mentioned the 60s, 70s with homosexuality being a disorder, it was. And then now anything that looks at it as a disorder is taken out. And there's a couple reasons for that, because in history, it's gone from, okay, this is a mental disorder. Well, those in the transgender society and in homosexuality, queer theory, all of these different issues, they have a little bit of a paradox, because in one sense, they want it to be biological, right? But on the other sense, that, for lack of a better term, it bites them, right? Because the biggest thing with transgender homosexual is choice.
Right.
They want to be able to choose. But if they say, yes, it's biological, then you're taking away that part of their desire to be able to be fluid, to choose, to make it their own. And in this book, one of the things that it gives is the primary understanding by queer theory and their influence in this. And if I can read this for a second.
Yeah. Can you tell us the title of the book and the author?
Yes,
so we
yes. This is
know what we're listening to.
Sure. This is Understanding Transgender Identities, and it gives 4 views. So that's the subtitle. And so what that does is you'll have different questions throughout, and one person will be the main answer, and then you'll have a rebuttal by the other 3 authors.
And are
And this
these
is
are these biblical counselors, Christian counselors, or?
I would not say that they're biblical counselors, but it is definitely from trying to get different Christian views on it. I don't know that I would agree that they're all Christian views, but it is worth reading especially from an academic perspective, because you really see the different views that are out there.
But it's not a secular book, if you will. It is an attempt to address the issues from a Christian perspective.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so who's the author or the editor or?
Yeah, the editors are James K. I don't know how you actually say their last name is Bilby, and Paul Rhodes Eddy.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So go ahead.
Yeah, and actually the introduction, even if you bought it and that's all you read, it's really great because it gives a very strong historical and from historical to current perspective on how are we getting, like, how did we get here? And one of the things it talks about, if when I say queer theory, I want you to understand that queer used to be a really derogatory term, right? We'd say that they're very queer, and it was very derogatory and hurtful. Now that's not how they're using it. Queer theory is literally a word that was brought up, queer, from the transgender and homosexual culture. So they use it in a very different way to kind of describe that they're different and there's no normative, right?
Right.
But what they're talking about is, from this queer theory, they're saying that identity is fluid and malleable, and thus that gender is not an essence human beings possess, but rather a performance that they engage in. Gender is understood as potentially porous and permeable spatial territories, arguably numbering more than two, each capable of supporting rich and rapidly proliferating ecologies and embodied difference. And that's a lot of words in there to basically just say that gender is not binary, and they're saying it shouldn't be binary, and it shouldn't be stagnant. Like, if you can be female at one point and you can change to something else at another point. And this is very important to understand, because this is one of the reasons why, if I say it's biological, then one, it could be a disorder, but two, then it can't really be fluid. And if it's going to be biological and fluid, then it also has to be some biological understanding of fluidity, right? And it just doesn't work. Scientifically, that doesn't work. And the reason that I bring that up is because what we have to understand goes all the way back to Genesis 3. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because the biggest thing, the biggest perspective that they want, and when I say they, the transgender culture advocates and homosexual advocates, is when we say that it's biological, when we give a disorder to it or something like that, it undercuts, and this is specifically from them, undercuts human agency. Humans having authority over their own bodies and their own destinies, their own thought process, their own feelings, all of it. Well, when we go back to Genesis 3, that's exactly what Eve struggled with, right? I want to decide what is good for me. And I'm assuming that God's good isn't good enough. And so when this temptation came that said, well, and questioned all of God's goodness, that was like, wow, yeah, I don't want to be told what's right. I don't want to be told who I am. I want to decide that for myself. I want to be able to do that. And so we have to understand that this is not something that's just out of nowhere, what we're experiencing. For a lack of being soft or very careful on this literally is Satan's work from all along. If I want to undermine God, I have to undermine his goodness. I have to undermine his word. I have to question everything that he's decided for me and about me as the creator. I have to undermine that. And so when we see that, it is the biggest thing is decisions that are made for us question our self-determination and our agency. And as human beings, we don't like that. And it says later on in this book, from such a perspective, gender variant children should never be saddled with a pathologizing labels such as gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria, but rather, and this is the transgender culture saying this, but rather should be seen, for example, simply as engaging in gender identity creativity as they come to express their true gender self.
This is huge, Pamela, and I think a lot. I think a lot of Christians and conservatives don't understand this, because I hear a lot of people arguing science. That there are scientific differences between men and women, but that's not at all the issue here. The issue is, as you say, human agency and just the ability for people to choose. And this is a relatively recent evolution in the whole conversation, at least on one level, because you have I can remember specific statements and even music and other things saying, we're born this way. And that was a big part of the conversation not that long ago. But that really isn't at the heart of this, is it? It's really what you're saying about human agency. And in fact, I've seen studies where for a lot of people in the movement, they will. There is a lot of fluidity on sexual choice and identity. How the way that they identify, it can change over time, and they want to maintain that ability to change. And so the conversation has shifted away from biological issues or science. It's about human agency and the ability to choose. So I just think that's huge, and I just wanted to highlight that. But that is part of this conversation, right? That it has shifted, and a lot of people are still debating the science and the biological differences. But that really has nothing to do with it in the minds of people in the movement, correct?
Well, I would say that it's, like I said before, a little bit of a paradox, because they don't want people questioning if they were born that way or not. They want that to be a given, that this is part of who they are, right? So you've got this little bit of a biological side to it, but then they don't want to be biologically determined, because then which is it? Are they this gender, or are they this gender, or are they, two other mixes of gender? Well, then how do we prove fluidity? So there's a little bit of a paradox with it, because does that make sense? That they don't want it to be something that they've just chosen, but they also want it to be something that they can choose. So there's a bit of a paradox with it. And that's why you won't find a book just saying that it was something that they were born with, but you're also not going to find a book that says it's just something that they choose, because they contradict one another.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today for this first part of our conversation with Pamela Cubas from the Calvary University Biblical Counseling Department about gender dysphoria and how to have productive conversations with family and friends about this thorny but very important issue. So look for the second part. You won't want to miss it. I promise. But until then, grace and peace.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.